Welcome to the Princeton Flying School Podcast with Pete Rafle, Princeton Flying School Instructor Emeritus. In this episode, Pete sat down with Colin Unsworth, ex-U.S. Air Force Colonel and retired FedEx Captain. Pete and Colin discussed a wide range of aviation topics and shared stories regarding flight training, weather conditions, military operations, flying passengers, flying cargo, flight emergencies, and even a UFO sighting. So without further introduction, let's join the conversation with Pete Rafle and Colin Unsworth.
Welcome, everybody, to this edition of the Princeton Flying School Podcast. I'm Pete Rafle. I'm a former chief pilot here at the school, and I invite members of the aviation community to come in and talk to me about all kinds of topics relating to airplanes, airline careers, general aviation, whatever involves flying and airplanes. And today I have invited Colin Unsworth, retired Air Force Reserve Colonel and retired Captain of FedEx. Colin and I have known each other for a few years, and he's always been an entertaining speaker and always has great stories to tell about flying. And since he has also, I should be looking at him and saying, since you have also flown predominantly large airplanes during your career, you share my same love for big airplanes. Those fighter pilots who always have clean flight suits, and they don't have to worry about oil dripping on them and other kinds of things, and don't have to worry about strange animals in the cargo hold or other interesting cargo items.
True.
So I welcome you here today, Colin.
Thank you very much.
Could you just give me a brief summary of your airline experience and aviation experience? I know that you went in the Air Force, you already had some general aviation time. Is that right?
Actually, when I was in college, a friend of mine came up, new friend of mine in my freshman year. He came up to me and says, Colin, he says, they've got a flying club here at this school. And let's go to their meeting. And it turns out this young man had his student pilot license, and I knew nothing about airplanes, and always enjoyed watching airplanes, but had never actually, flown in a little one. So we go over to this meeting, and we ended up joining the school flying club. They had a little Cessna 150, and I ended up taking lessons. In fact, lessons were $6 an hour, wet, which at the time was in the 60s. This is the late 60s. Seemed like a lot of money. It certainly doesn't sound like.
Yeah, but as I remember, avgas was only 40 cents a gallon.
Something like that. That's right. So I ended up getting my private license, and by then I was pretty much hooked on this aviation stuff. And Vietnam War was still going on. I was not relishing the thought of getting drafted, and so I joined the Air Force. And so by then I had about 100 hours in little airplanes, and joined the Air Force, and they gave me a pilot training slot, and it all started there. Back then, the Air Force actually put me in a Cessna 172, and of course, since I had already, had about 100 hours, that was pretty easy. And then they put me in a T-37, a little twin-engine, twin-seat airplane, pilots sit next to each other. And from there, it goes to a supersonic T-38, which was an unbelievable airplane to fly. So I got about 75 hours in a T-37, about 114 hours in a T-38, and Vietnam War was still going on. And what did they put me into for my first assignment? But an O2, which was the Cessna Skymaster. And they said, you're going to go to Nakhon Phanom, Thailand as a forward air controller. And I'm thinking, oh, really? Okay. So, but as luck or whatever else would come out of it, I was just started my training in the O2, and they canceled it. Vietnam War was winding. They signed the peace treaty in February 73, I believe. And they said, okay, and you get one of these calls that only happens once in the service. And Pete, you realize that, when they say jump, you kind of say, yes, how far? Well, this guy called me up and he said, we're taking away your O2 assignment and you can fly anything you want as long as it's not a fighter. And this was going to be primarily large airplanes. And I said, anything? And he says, yes. I said, this is an opportunity, this is amazing. So I said, well, how about a C-141? Because my plans at that time, I wanted to fly heavy airplanes. And he said, well, okay. How about at Travis Air Force Base out in California? And I said, well, where is that? And he says, well, it's just a little bit east of San Francisco. I said, okay. And that was it. And so now I became a heavy airplane pilot. Went through the C-141 training, and for the next 6 years or so, I flew those C-141s almost all around the world, and we'll get into it. But just for now, I flew it as far north as 600 miles from the North Pole and down to Antarctica. So that was quite an experience. Got off active duty and ended up flying for a company called Flying Tigers, which was a company that had been started just after World War II by one of the pilots that flew for General Chennault of the China Flying Tiger fame. And so I hired on with them, and I flew as a DC-8 second officer or flight engineer, and then ended up flying in the 727 and a 747. And then by then, they got bought out by Federal Express, and I ended up flying the A300. And that was the last airplane I flew until I retired about 11 years ago.
Wow.
And that's the long and the short of it.
And just ballpark idea of total hours that you...
Well, I remember when I finished the Air Force, I got my last piece of paper that showed all flying tying, and it said exactly 5,000 hours. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but you got to remember, flying in the Air Force Reserve, we were only flying maybe once or twice a month. Right. And so hours were pretty slow to come by.
Right.
Civilian times, I kind of stopped keeping track of it. I'm guessing grand total of around 15,000 hours, but that's
easily, I'm sure.
That's a wild guess.
So, what I get asked a lot is, is flying these airplanes hard, or are large airplanes harder to fly than smaller general aviation or business type airplanes? What kind of advice would you give a young prospective pilot who was thinking about, can I really fly large airplanes?
Well, large airplanes, the training has now gotten to a point in large airplanes where almost everything is done in a simulator. And of course, yes, so large airplanes has, you have to learn systems. You learn electrical systems, fuel systems, hydraulic systems, bleed air systems. I mean, there's a lot of parts to the airplane that you have to learn. But the flying part actually is not that hard. You learn the techniques of flying a big airplane. It certainly doesn't have the, like the roll rate of a little airplane, things like that. But and it is heavier on the controls. Although now, these airplanes with hydraulically boosted controls, they can be surprisingly light. It doesn't take a lot of energy per se to fly. But once you get into your experience of flying, you start to realize that the physical part is not that hard. Now, yes, I'll admit, strong turbulence, 30 knots of crosswind on a landing on a slippery runway, yes, you're working pretty hard. But that's pretty rare. And really what I find that really the work that goes on is really all mental. First of all, you're flying in all kinds of weather. Like, for example, and if you're in a little airplane and it's a half a mile, a quarter mile visibility, and vertical visibility is about 100 or 200 feet, you're not going to go flying. But when you're in a commercial business, off you go, and you line up on the runway, and you might look out, and there's thunderstorms all over the place, and the wind is blowing at 30 to 40 knots. You know what? If for the most part, you go. Now, certainly, if it's not safe, you're not going to. But you don't have that option of not going in many cases. And so then it becomes, what do I do to plan ahead? First of all, be safe at all times. Plan ahead. You know what the weather is, your destination. You know whether weather is at your alternate. You always have an option. You don't want to be in a situation where you're looking at the amount of fuel you're on board, that you've got on board, and you're looking at your options for where to fly, and you realize, oh my goodness, I don't have enough gas to be safe. And that's the kind of thinking that's always going in your mind to be safe. So that's in many ways, that's the hard part.
Yeah, I always made the first object of my career was to be the world's oldest living aviator.
Exactly.
And so as I entered my 80th year, I guess I was successful so far.
I think you have.
I'm looking forward to being part of the Union of Flying Octogenarians, actually. I'm going to do that.
And you've, of course, there's old pilots and there's bold pilots, but there's very few old, bold pilots. It's the pilot that is always thinking safety at all times.
Your airline career and my airline career were different in one way, and that was that I had people who insisted on being fed while they rode in the back. You had boxes that demanded nothing of you, and you learned how to use that microwave oven in the galley or something to cook a crew meal in a funny little box, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
But tell me something about flying cargo around the world, which flying for Flying Tigers is legendary stuff. And I think of the great cargo carriers of before. These names are all gone. Remember World Airways and all that bunch. And when Continental was flying mostly cargo, I remember that, and also a lot of soldiers. But tell me what that was like to fly. I have flown cargo too, but it wasn't my only thing.
Well, people ask me, what's the difference between flying cargo and flying civilian or people? And maybe the first thing people might think is, oh, you've got to be much more smooth or something like that, flying, when you've got hundreds of people in the back. But my thought, and although most of my career was flying cargo, I was flying in military transport, and there was times we had 100 people in the back. Certainly not in the comfort that you would be thinking of in a regular passenger airline, but we carried people. But my basic thought was, if me, sitting up there in the front, if I am safe and happy, then by coincidence, everybody else in the back of that airplane, they're going to be safe and happy too. And so I really didn't think about the people in the back when I was carrying people. Mm-hmm. And of course, there is the thought that if you have to divert somewhere, if you're carrying passengers, you guess, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with all these people back there? But also in the back of my mind, when I had a couple of $1 million worth of freight that is being shipped somewhere and it's been guaranteed to arrive at 10 o'clock in the morning, for example, flying for Federal Express, that was always a concern. And so in many ways, flying, passengers or freight, I don't think the mindset that I had was really that much different. Certainly flying cargo, it was interesting in that we carried a lot of strange things at times. Most of the times we didn't know what was in those boxes in the back. But the time I walked on the airplane, I heard this cheep, 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 cheep. I'm looking around, and there is 5 pallets stacked 5 feet high of chickens, little chicks. Or the time we got on the airplane and we had a trainer on board, and he introduces himself. Turns out he's escorting Clarence the lion, the MGM lion from movie fame, for a photo shoot. And I'll kind of digress here, a real quick story. So we landed at our place in one of our stations there, and he says, well, do you want to see the lion? And we said, well, of course we want to see the lion. And so we get off the airplane. By then they had dropped the cage down onto the ground, and he opens up the cage, and he puts a leash on the lion and escorts this lion out onto the ramp. and we're about 3 feet from this lion. And we said, wow, that's pretty neat. And he says, well, yeah, I'm waiting for a van to pick me up for this photo shoot. And we said, okay. And then we said, oh, do you think you could show our cargo agent in the office this lion? And he said, well, of course. And so we led this lion into the office, and this poor young lady sitting there at her computer, she turns around and she is 1 foot away from this lion that has his head is about 2.5 feet across. And she was on one of those chairs with rollers on the back, and she gave a push off and she rolled about 20 feet across the floor with this absolute look of horror on her face. But we carried another time. We carried albino hippos, which was a gift from Nepal to the United States, and we carried it to Baltimore Washington Airport, where it went to the Washington National Zoo.
Wow!
So lions and tigers, and no bears, but a lot of different stories like that.
I remember a load of horses on a 707.
Yeah.
And we had they had a half dozen trainers. We had 2 rows of seats set up for them, but the horses were on these special pallets in the back. And the procedure was if any of them got excited, the routine was we're going to depressurize the airplane and knock the horses down. And we had to brief those trainers that was the possibility if anything went wrong, that they had to keep those horses calm. Otherwise, we'd have them running up and down or something would be a problem.
Yeah.
But it never really turned into anything more than a very smelly airplane.
And I never did that, but they had cattle charters where you'd be full of cattle and take them over to Japan. And yes, everything smelled.
The worst I ever had was strawberries. I always thought that was the most cloying, difficult thing to deal with in an airplane was strawberries. We were talking once, and we were just joking around about UFOs. And Captain, did you really see a UFO ever?
Well, all right. The simple answer is actually yes.
Okay. Could you explain for my listeners as to what?
At the time, we said, wow, that is a UFO, because it was unidentified flying object. We were flying in the early hours of the morning from Indianapolis to, I think it was Philadelphia. And the sun had not risen yet, so it was starting to get light in front of us to the east. It was dark overhead. And all of a sudden, we see this, looked like a very expanded contrail going from left to right. And it was just streaking across the sky. It was way above us, producing this big plume across the sky. And we're thinking, all right, first thought was maybe it's some, SR-71 or something. He's at, 90-something thousand feet way to the east. He's in the sunlight, and he's producing this contrail. And so actually a number of people all of a sudden got on the radio and said to New York Center, do you have any traffic up ahead real high going from north to south? And the New York Center said, I don't have anybody out there. And so at that point, we're thinking, wow, I have no idea what this thing is. Well, that lasted until that morning when we saw in the newspaper that it was a Russian booster re-entering the atmosphere and burning up. And so we said, oh, well, no UFO. Another time, and this was not a personal story, but a crew member that I knew was flying into a rising sun, and there was all of a sudden this bright light, maybe about a half hour before sunrise, this bright light coming up over the horizon. And, you're at 30-some-odd thousand feet, and it is pretty noticeable. Well, this co-pilot calls up air traffic control, and this was over in the ocean, so he calls up over HF radio, and he says, I've got traffic at my 12 o'clock. And the controller says, well, we don't have anything in your vicinity. And so being a good co-pilot and being safe, he says, I'd like clearance to climb, because he's sure it's coming right at him. And sure enough, he climbs another 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet, and it's still there. Turns out he was looking at Venus as it was rising before the sun. It was coming up, and it was super clear morning, and it can be very bright. And so he certainly thought that was a UFO.
So if he had been also qualified as a celestial navigator, he might have looked at the almanac and realized what it was.
True.
But you told me an interesting story that I'd like to share with everybody about off the Sea of Japan at night. You saw something that you thought might be.
I was brand new co-pilot. This was my military years in the C-141, and we had taken off out of Yokota, Japan, which is slightly to the west of Tokyo, and we're flying. It's a 10-hour flight to the west coast of the U.S., and it's midnight or something like that, pitch black out there, and all of a sudden you look down and you see lights all over the place. It's like if you were seeing a small city, but it's spread out from almost horizon to horizon, and it goes all the way to your horizon in front of you, and then you see stars above that, and you cannot tell the difference between those stars and those lights below you. And the first thing I'm thinking is, we are way off course because we're over land. I mean, what else could it be? And it turns out it's those big Japanese fishing fleets. They're fishing with lights out there to, I guess, draw the fish up to the surface. And every single one of those boats is illuminated, and there's hundreds of them. And until you realize what it is, you have no idea what you're looking at.
Yeah, for the folks who are listening who have never flown over the ocean at night with a full galaxy filling the sky of all those stars, you can become very disoriented to the point where you think you're vertical, and those stars are lights on the ground below you and not above you, and you can't tell where the horizon is.
And you can't. And in fact, we were flying over the North Atlantic one time, and the northern lights were up, and we're amazed. I mean, but it was not the streaks of like curtain northern lights above you that you see in photographs. It was kind of like a layer of lights that were kind of stretched over the horizon. But the funny thing was, they were stretched at about a 30-degree angle, so that it gave you a false sense of the horizon. And so we're flying along, and we turn the lights way down, and we're looking at all these northern lights, and we turn the lights back on, and everybody in the cockpit was leaning over at about a 30-degree angle from horizontal, because your instinct is those lights were a new horizon, and our horizon was tilted. And we had to keep looking at our attitude indicator to make sure that, yes, we were flying straight and level. But it's sometimes your visual sense of what's happening gets a little bit skewed.
Yeah, like flying between layers and having the high cirrus layer not level. Of course, it's not always level, but your brain says that should be level and the airplane should be turning, and you got to resist all those temptations. That's right. Hours and hours and hours and hours of boredom, but there must be a few exciting moments that turn into stark terror, or somewhat short of that, hopefully. But any emergencies with complex systems like a C-141 or a 747? The book is only 6 inches thick on all the systems in those
That's
airplanes.
true. And knock on wood, thank goodness, I did not have anything really serious. And the amazing thing about training these days, especially with simulators, is that you practice a lot of emergencies. The most common one probably is an engine failure. And the worst time that can happen is right after you get airborne, after takeoff. You practice loss of hydraulic systems, and most airplanes have at least 3 or 4 separate hydraulic systems that are feeding certain things, and so everything is being backed up, and you can lose 1 or 2 hydraulic systems and the airplane is still controllable. But surprisingly, in my 15+ thousand hours of flying, I've only shut down 2 engines. In fact, one of them was, we got on the ground and the maintenance looked at it and they said, this engine's fine. It's the oil pressure gauge that failed, and it was showing 0 psi. But guess what? You've got plenty of oil in the engine, and so you shut it down you didn't have to shut it down. Of course, you don't know that in the air. And another time, we took off and we lost our primary hydraulic system, and we diverted into another base. But those were problems that we had practiced, and we'd practiced over and over in the simulator. Another time, I had a whole back of the airplane full of actually air crew members, and we lost our ability to put our flaps all the way down. And so we flew what we said was a no flap, 0 flap landing. But that's something that had been practiced. And so in many ways, I didn't consider them emergencies. They were something that I was familiar with what I was going to do, and I did them. And so thank goodness, knock on wood, I did not have to rely on my superior airmanship skills.
Well, obviously they have served you well all these years, for sure. We were talking about thunderstorms and trying to avoid thunderstorms. With the amount of flying, the number of miles in any one of your missions, how can you avoid having to go through a line of thunderstorms at some point?
Many times you can't, but people think, oh, you're in a jet airplane, just climb over those thunderstorms.
Not always.
You say about international, but even here, right in the middle of the United States, over Oklahoma, they call it, was it Thunderstorm Alley, or it's where thunderstorms can go to 60,000 feet.
Yes.
And guess what? Airplanes, transport airplanes, certainly, the highest altitude, you could really go with maybe 39, 41,000 feet. And so what do you do when you come up on thunderstorms? You go around them. You coordinate with air traffic control, and you say, and you're looking at the radar, and you say, I want to go, 15, 20, 30 miles left or right of my course around thunderstorms. And most of the time, the air traffic controller, they just say, report back on course, and you go around them. And talking about the difficulty of flying and how hard you work. We were flying from Cleveland to Memphis one night, and we actually had one of our company managers on board, and he watched us fight for an hour and a half going around thunderstorms. We were, eyes glued to a radar scope, and we were turning left, turning right, coordinating with air traffic control, and did this for, 90 minutes. And when we landed, he says, oh, wow, I can see you guys are really working hard. And we said, yeah. And he says, I'm glad your night is over. And we said, no, because in 3 hours we have to turn around and we have to go back again, and we're going to do it again. And so, yes, you stay out of thunderstorms. Although one time we had a radar failure, and we're flying through clouds, and we're trying to rely on air traffic control to tell us where the thunderstorms were. And we went through the top of a thunderstorm, and the turbulence was so severe that all you do is hang on. Your eyeballs are bouncing around so much that you can't read the instruments. Everything that's loose in the cockpit is bouncing around in the cockpit, and you just wait for it to be over. And all you can do is just say, "I'm going to fly straight and level," and luckily, that time it only lasted about 30 seconds, although it seemed like forever. Mm-hmm. So yes, number one rule, you never fly through a thunderstorm. And you can read the accident reports. There are airplanes where they went into a thunderstorm and it rips the wings off.
Yep.
And so that's pretty serious.
Yep. I've never gotten to fly to Antarctica, but you did. And is it true you landed a 141 down there?
Yes.
On ice or on snow or?
Yeah, it's really interesting. This was Operation
skis, do you?
No skis. Operation Deep Freeze, and then they fly airplanes down there in the spring just before winter, and in the fall right after the summertime. And they actually would take, I'm guessing it was around 10,000 feet of ice, and they would bulldoze a nice smooth landing strip, and they would they'd paint 55-gallon drums black and outline this area, because that's the only way you can tell where the runway is, where it starts and where it ends. And you land on the ice. And regular wheeled airplane. Mm-hmm. Surprisingly, the temperatures are so cold that it's not any more slippery than a wet runway. A wet runway with just rain on it. Yeah. So we would land, and then they were saying, we were flying this in the springtime, so things were starting to thaw out. And we said, well, how thick is this ice? And he says, well, interesting that you should ask. We test this every couple of days. And he says, it's only about 20 inches thick. Of course, you're landing an airplane that weighs, 250,000 pounds on this ice. And we just trusted that they knew how thick it needed to be. But it was actually turned into a non-event. The one thing about flying down to Antarctica that was interesting was that there's no alternates. Once you get past a point where you have not enough fuel to turn around and go back, in this case we were flying out of New Zealand, once you've passed that point, you're landing in Antarctica, whether the weather is good or not. And so we had the rule where we had to be in radio contact with McMurdo with a good weather forecast before we would continue. So that was always a problem. But other than that, landing on the ice was not a problem.
Yeah, the only ice landing I ever made was in a 172 at Alton Bay up in New Hampshire. When that's open only 1 or 2 weeks of the year, and you land right on the lake. And it was an exciting thing. But I would think Antarctica is far better than that.
Far better.
Far better. You and I share flying into Kai Tak in Hong Kong. The stonecutter approach.
The stonecutter approach. I remember as a young Air Force officer knowing about this approach. It was, especially anybody that flew international, always had heard about this stonecutter approach. And normally, when you line up on a runway on an instrument approach, from around 5 miles out or so, maybe even longer, there's a final approach fix, and you go even in an ILS or something like that, and you slide down the glide slope, and you're all lined up with the runway, and you land. Well, the stonecutter approach in Hong Kong was very much different. You got on an ILS, it had a localizer which tells you how far you are left and right. You have a glide slope indicator that tells you how far above and below this required glide slope is. Yet in this case, that glide slope and localizer led you straight into a stone mountain. And painted on the side of this mountain was a big checkerboard, red and white checkerboard. And you would fly down to a certain altitude, and then you made a hard right turn. And then, after a 90-degree right-hand turn, you lined up with the runway at about 300 feet above the ground. And so it was a very unique approach. And because of the hills all around Hong Kong, and because of the population is so great, every one of those hills is covered with apartment buildings.
And that's 300 feet off the television antennas on those houses, correct?
And you would look out as you made this turn, and you had to almost look up to see the tops of these buildings, and because you're in between these hills with these buildings. And so it was a very unique approach. And no longer, that airport is no longer there, and anybody that's flown in that part of the world, and you ask them about the Hong Kong approach, they all nod knowingly, say, oh, yes. And they look at that with maybe not fond memories, but interesting memories.
Well, certainly pride of having done it successfully.
That's right.
That's for sure. We have just a few minutes left, and I really want to touch base on two important events. One was that you participated in am I correct, the evacuation of Saigon?
Yes, April 1975. Although the war was officially over in early 73, By April of 75, the North Vietnamese were coming into South Vietnam, and they came into Saigon. Many people that had worked for the U.S. government, and we had been in a presence in Vietnam for over 10 years by then. Many people were really afraid of what would happen if they got caught by the North Vietnamese. And so there was a big evacuation of not only U.S. personnel, but also civilian personnel that had worked for the U.S. government that truly had their lives. They were worrying about their lives. And as we went in there, I was again flying the C-141. There was also a worry of anti-aircraft emplacements within 5 miles of the airport. And this was the Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon. And so we had a very interesting way of getting in there. At around 14,000 feet, we'd go right over the field at 14,000 feet, and we would start depressurizing the airplane. And by the time you got down to 10,000 feet, they would open up 2 emergency escape hatches, which were just aft of the engines. And they put in that hatch like a mounting bar, which held 2 Very pistols, which are pistols that are for search and rescue.
They shoot a flare with them.
It's a flare pistol. And the idea was that if somebody fired a surface-to-air missile after you, and back then it was called the SA-7, which was a shoulder-mounted anti-aircraft missile, that you would fire this flare pistol, and this flare would go behind the engine, and hopefully the anti-aircraft missile would seek that hot flare and follow the flare instead of following into your engine. We have no idea whether this would have worked, but from 10,000 feet right over the field, we would do a tight 30 to 45 degree bank and just circle all the way down to the runway and then land, all staying within about 3 miles of the field. Right. And then when we would take off, we would turn all our lights off, and we would take off in a blacked out condition. So that was very interesting. Carrying refugees, and I'll just say one little thing about it was very touching, is these people would get on the airplane, and all they were allowed is what they could put into a pillowcase. And they were leaving their homeland, and many of them never thinking that they would never come back. And we would carry... Normally 150 people carried in a 141. We would pack 250 of these people into that airplane. No seats, sit them on the floor, and off we would go. So that was very interesting.
I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I flew a penetration in the 707 in '69 into Tan Son Nhut, delivering dogs, police dogs. Talk about smelly cockpits, smelly cabins. Yeah. And then you were called back. You were called up in the reserves to Desert Storm.
Yeah, I was in my 19th year in the Air Force. I was getting ready to get out, and the Desert Storm in '91 was going on, and all of a sudden I got a call, and they said, "Our unit has been activated. You're going to be active duty now." And I spent about 6 months on active duty. Flying primarily between Spain and Saudi Arabia, carrying everything. It could be mail, it could be weapons, it could be bombs, it could be, in fact, one time it was Patriot missiles. And we would fly into Saudi Arabia, a number of air bases there, and deliver them. It was long days, sometimes 24 hours to a day. And it was pretty much just exhausting flying. And then you're, of course, flying into a war zone, although surprisingly, it wasn't the combat part that worried me, because it was after one time I was talking to this fighter pilot, and he was talking about these packages. I says, "What's a package?" He says, "Oh, it's about 150 of our U.S. airplanes going up north, up into Iraq." And it would be tankers, fighters, fighter bombers. It would be anti-radar airplanes going in there. It would be all these people going up north in a huge package of airplanes. And my thought was, keep me as a good old transport pilot, just keep me away from those things. And so certainly I was thinking about, I don't want to get into a near miss with one of those things.
Wow. We've had a wonderful conversation. There's enough for another hour for us to talk together.
There is, yes.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to say goodbye at this point. But I'd like you to just give me some final thoughts on your flying career and your obvious love and dedication to aviation and airplanes.
Flying is immensely satisfying. You have a job that has to be done. There's times when you say, I really don't want to go out tonight. Thunderstorms and lightning and everything else. But there's times when you're cruising along, and for me, which, flying for Federal Express was a lot of night flying, but there'd be times you'd be flying along and their sun was just starting to come up, and it's beautiful, smooth flying weather, and you think, I am very fortunate to see these kind of things. I remember when I first qualified on the airplane, I walked in the back of the airplane, stretch my legs, and I said, wow, I'm in charge of all this. And that sense of responsibility and your confidence that you can handle all the duties and safety that you're responsible for is very self-satisfying. And I look back on those years with very much fond memories.
Good. Well, thank you for joining us and giving us some good memories here. And we have enough that we might want to talk about your coming back again, and we'll talk about some more things.
Well, thank you very much, Pete. I've thoroughly enjoyed talking with you, and I will be happy to come back at another day.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thanks to each of you who are listening, who have been listening to us for the last so many minutes. And we look forward to you joining us again real soon with another guest. It's Pete Rafle saying thanks a lot. Fair winds, good flying. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Princeton Flying School Podcast with Pete Rafle. Our podcasts are recorded at the Princeton Airport and are produced by HG Media. If you enjoyed our show, please share it with your friends. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts.